So today's video is going to be a non-spoiler book review for Crown of Feathers. While of course not every single book is going to appeal to every single person, this one did something that I was really pleased with, and that was that it contained very extensive world building. The history of the world, the way that certain groups of people fit into their world, the magic, the rules of the magic, how people feel about the magic, all of those things were elaborated on, but they were done so in a way that I thought was woven into the story quite well. It never really felt like I was stopping to learn what everything meant. I will say there was a tad exception to that in the history portion of it, because at the beginning of every chapter, you get a little snippet of some past characters, some past people in their world. You get a little snippet of their perspectives, and you also often get documents outlining sometimes certain songs or myths or legends, things of that sort, or even sometimes letters between different people in the past. You'll get those sorts of things, but I thought that was such a cool element to see. That said, I know world building isn't for everyone, and for some people it's actually a plus when a book can be really entertaining and not have a ton of world building. This one, it has a lot, and sometimes I was wondering how significant is this little bit of history that the characters are talking about right now, or who is this person in history again, even though there were some moments like that. If you are looking for a YA book that has a lot of good world building, this has got it. Getting into the actual premise of this story though, we follow a girl named Veronica. She is 16 years old and she is living with her older sister. Her older sister is a parental figure to her as well as being a sibling. The two of them are fending for themselves. They are trying to survive in this world that has really oppressed people called animages. Animages are individuals who have the ability to communicate with animals, and more specifically, animages have the potential to bond with phoenixes. Based on this war that took place that had phoenix riders in it, and the phoenix riders lost, now the Empire is trying to do everything they can to make sure that phoenix riders never come back, and anybody who is an animage has the potential to be a phoenix rider. So these two sisters are both animages. Both actually are also shadow mages as well. It has to do a little bit with magic to do with the mind and manipulation. Our main character, Veronica, doesn't really know how to control that portion of her magic, but she's very in tune with her animal magic. Some pretty tragic things end up occurring in Veronica's life, and she ends up having a rift with her sister, and instead of relying on her sister to help her become a phoenix rider, she ends up joining this rebel group that is in hiding. But in order to potentially become a phoenix rider in this group, she ends up having to disguise herself as a boy. What was interesting about this rebellious group is that they didn't hate on girls for being girls. They didn't have any specific rules against girls. It just so happened that most of the people that they had accepted to give these phoenix eggs to were boys, and so at this point they have such a limited amount that to try and implement a girl into the group might cause a little bit of trouble. It might be a situation where the girl feels really pushed out, and so they just kind of figured it would be easier to just recruit boys. And Veronica, seeing this, decides she doesn't want to risk them excluding her because she's a girl. That is why she disguises herself as a boy, but it presents some really interesting self-conflict within Veronica, because there's so many times throughout the story that she realizes, I'm not being particularly truthful with those around me, and these are people that I really respect. These are people that I want to be with for the rest of my life. These are wonderful individuals who are trying to bring back the Phoenix Riders, and she questions whether or not she's doing the right thing, which often I find in stories where somebody has to kind of put themselves in disguise in some way. It's because society is terrible and they have something against them. And that wasn't really the case in this situation, and Veronica has this conflict constantly. She has this internal struggle, and that was just very different from what I normally see with this particular kind of plotline. One thing that I do want to kind of make clear with this story is it does feel a little bit like it is setting up for a bigger world, and the reason I want to kind of point that out is because it sounds like it would be so action-packed. There's this rebellious group of phoenix riders, these people that are trying to put themselves back into society instead of being shut down. And so you kind of imagine, oh, they're gonna be like flying through the skies with these awesome firebirds and it's gonna be amazing. So even though I enjoyed this story, I do think that this is setting up a lot for the future stories. It's a little slow, which I thought was okay, but I know the slower pace isn't for everybody. Not to say the book wasn't engaging or that there was zero action. There's definitely some action in the story, and there are definitely things that make you want to turn the page, but it wasn't because they're constantly fighting or anything like that. We actually get a lot of character development, and we have 3 different characters. We have Veronica, then we have one of the people that Veronica is with at this particular group. His name is Tristan. His story arc I really enjoyed. When you first meet him, he seems very, very arrogant. He is the son of the individual that is currently in charge of this group. He's kind of a very stoic, rigid person, and so his son Tristan, the perspective that we get, he is trying to fill what feels like the impossible standards of his father. He is very, very well trained, but his father just never seems pleased enough with him. So when we first meet him, he just seems really put off by everybody. Seems like he has a little bit of a temper, but the more you get to know him, I just thought that him as a person, I really enjoyed seeing how he grows, how him and Veronica's relationship with one another, how it is complementary, but also just seeing how first impressions, they're not always true. The third perspective that we get is a character named Seb, and his perspective is the most alienated from the other 2. He is currently a soldier for the Empire, but his family was, well, things happened because of the Empire. The Empire is actually responsible for Seb's life being terrible, but to try and just survive, Seb has decided to join the Empire under some interesting circumstances. So his story is very interesting, and he is very conflicted. He wants to be heroic, but he also feels the best way to stay alive is by catching nobody's attention, and that doesn't necessarily lend itself for heroic deeds. All 3 of these characters are fairly significant, although I would say Veronica is the main character, and I really enjoyed her. She is not this super feisty, I've got a temper like character, which sometimes is common, and she's not really like that at all. For those of you who have read the Lunar Chronicles and you know of Cress, she reminds me a little bit of Cress. For those of you that haven't read it, that's completely fine. So her character is one that she is more inclined to be sweet and kind and supportive than she is to be really in your face and needs you to understand that her will is the best way or anything like that. That is not her character. She is so nice, and she, because she is this animage, has this incredible relationship with animals, and she is just so sweet, and I really loved seeing that. She was sweet, but she also had a really strong will. The writing in this story is also, I thought, really polished. It felt really clean. I enjoyed the writing style. One tiny little thing that I don't think most people would even really notice, but for me it was a little bit, I wouldn't say it was a bad thing, but it definitely, I thought, made it so it didn't read as smoothly, was that sometimes whenever we would have conversations between characters, the conversation would be broken up with a lot of narrative, and usually that narrative was kind of from the point of view of the character. So not internal dialogue, but just the character would be kind of thinking through what had just been said, and then sometimes it would extend into their pasts and how they felt that something that happened with their past or something that happened with other characters in their pasts, how those kinds of things sort of tied in with what was just said. And then so by the time we got to the next bit of dialogue, it didn't read as smoothly. This is kind of both a pro and a con depending on how you look at it. I think that it is written in a way that those particular things about the writing style, I think those are helpful for a slightly younger audience, because a lot of times for those of us who read both young adults and adults, or who read young adult books that are geared maybe toward the upper ends of young adult readers, there's often times when we don't need everything the character is feeling or thinking to be addressed. We can just have one quick little physical action or reaction, and that kind of says it all. So somebody just kind of grunting slightly or somebody smirking slightly, that can tell you a lot. However, when you are younger, you not only have limited experiences with reading and therefore picking up on context clues, you also just have limited experiences when it comes to reading other human beings. And so when you have these paragraphs where we are kind of getting more into the character's head and understanding how they're feeling, I think that is just, I think it's helpful for slightly younger readers if somebody is like 12 or 13, and I hope nobody is 12 or 13 and is reading this thinking I'm telling them that they're stupid and they don't know how to tell that if somebody's like, ugh, that person's annoyed. I know that that's pretty obvious, but sometimes some books, they can have not enough, and then sometimes with books like this, I think we can get a lot of the characters' reactions and feelings and things of that sort spelled out for us a little bit more. What this does do is it establishes how the characters feel all the time. So you're never second guessing the character. You definitely feel like you know the characters really, really well. And I also think, even though there were occasionally times I thought, okay, yeah, I get it. I would imagine that's how this character would feel. Even though every now and then I had those moments, I ultimately was pleased because I think there are a lot of conversations that have come up recently that young adult doesn't really feel young anymore. It definitely feels like all the people who used to read young adult are getting older, and the whole section is kind of moving up with them, but then we're losing all the people who are going from middle grade and getting into young adult. And it makes me happy because this, I think, is something, with the exception of one scene that's kind of violent, this is something that I think people who are going from middle grade into young adults can pick up. Also, there's animal companions, and I love animal companions in books. I feel like we're losing out on that too. I don't see that very often anymore, and I love that about the fantasy genre. I love that in this story, the magic is primarily centered around people having a connection with animals, and I think that is so fun. I mentioned earlier that I think the world building is amazing, and I think it's done well with this particular element, because something as simple as how would characters who have a connection with animals feel about eating meat, even that little detail was explored, and I thought that the justification for the characters in how they feel toward that was very interesting to see. But that's just a small example of the kind of world building detail that the author put in. If the premise sounds interesting to you and you are completely fine reading something that is centered in character development and world building, an interesting world, and was probably meant to sort of lay the groundwork for future books in the series, I think you would really, really, really enjoy this, especially if you like animal companions and stories. I think you'd really like this. However, I can definitely see where this might, because it is maybe more on the young side of young adult in some ways, maybe it wouldn't be for you if you really, really, really prefer stories that are more mature in themes. I think there are great themes in this, but if you are the kind of person that wants the more adult content, then this might be a little less up your alley. For those of you who have read this book, let me know what your thoughts were on it. Let me know if you agreed or disagreed with some of the points that I made. And if you haven't read the book, let me know if you think it sounds interesting. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you all later. Bye.